The Jedi Council's inaction had a body count, and the galaxy was keeping score. 3,976 BBY. Mandalorian warriors under Mandalore the Ultimate launched a systematic campaign of conquest across Republic space, planet by planet, settlement by settlement, an advancing tide of organized violence that the Republic's military strained to contain. The Jedi Council watched. They detected, they believed, a greater hidden threat lurking behind the Mandalorian advance, and they counseled patience. The Great Sith War had already devastated the Order's numbers. Another major conflict, engaged prematurely, against an enemy possibly being manipulated by something worse. The Council's logic was coherent. The galaxy found it catastrophic. Entire worlds were being annexed, and the Order tasked with defending civilization was meditating on its strategic options. One Jedi Knight had already witnessed the Cathar massacre, a genocide Mandalorian forces had committed against an entire people, a truth the Council chose to suppress rather than act upon. That decision ended his patience with the institution. He didn't file a dissent. He started a movement. He rallied every Jedi willing to follow him. He donned the mask of a fallen Mandalorian warrior, a deliberate symbolic declaration, armor stripped from an enemy and repurposed as a banner. He took a name his followers would carry, Revan. The Revanchists grew quickly enough that the Council's ability to suppress or redirect the movement ran out before their willingness to try did. They reluctantly acknowledged his generalship only after his force had swelled too large to ignore, and even then, the acknowledgement came from political calculation rather than conviction. Revan had outmaneuvered the institution by simply going ahead without its permission. His approach to the war he'd started wasn't the Jedi Code in practice. It was victory at all costs, increasingly costly sacrifices accepted without apparent hesitation, collateral damage absorbed as an operational variable, tactics calibrated to win rather than to demonstrate the Order's moral standards. He won engagements the Council's more cautious strategy would never have attempted. He also accepted costs that would haunt anyone paying close attention. He won the war at Malachor V in 3960 BBY. The victory didn't look like one. Revan had already killed Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat earlier in the campaign, and the kill's aftermath mattered as much as the death. He took the Mandalore's mask, not as a conventional trophy, but as a deliberate act of erasure. In Mandalorian culture, whoever could claim the title continued the warrior tradition, rallied the clans, gave the culture its next chapter. By taking the mask, Revan broke the succession. The Mandalorian warrior tradition was left without a head to regenerate around. He didn't just defeat them, he structured the defeat to be permanent. At Malachor V itself, General Mitra Surik activated the Mass Shadow Generator, an experimental gravity projection superweapon that fractured the planet beneath both fleets simultaneously. Republic and Mandalorian alike, devastated in the same detonation. Both sides paid the price of ending the war on that battlefield. The force wound created by the weapon's activation was felt galaxy-wide, a scar in the fabric of reality that would produce consequences neither Revan nor anyone else understood yet. What happened after the war's end is where Revan's arc passes through its point of no return. He and Malak traveled into the unknown regions, the territory beyond Republic space where navigation charts ran out and civilization thinned to nothing. What they found there bent both of them completely. They discovered the Star Forge, an ancient Rakatan construction drawing its power from the dark side of the Force, capable of producing warships and weapons at scales that should have been physically impossible. They visited Korriban, the ancestral Sith homeworld. They acquired forbidden knowledge from sources the Republic had no record of. They came back changed in ways neither fully acknowledged to themselves or each other, and the change had a name. They returned as Darth Revan and Darth Malak, launched the Jedi Civil War, and built a new Sith empire using the Star Forge as their industrial engine. Then Malak fired on Revan's own flagship. Malak had watched his master's increasingly brutal calculus throughout the Mandalorian Wars, the collateral damage absorbed without apparent guilt, the victory at all costs approach that had won the war and poisoned the man winning it. When a Jedi strike team ambushed Revan's ship, Malach made his move. He fired on the vessel while the ambush was in progress. Revan was found barely alive in the wreckage. What the Council did with him is either the most pragmatic act in Jedi history or its most monstrous, and KOTOR never tells you which framing is correct. Revan's mind contained structural knowledge of the Sith Empire he'd built, its organization, its resources, its vulnerabilities. That knowledge was accessible if the right memories could be carefully reconstructed under controlled conditions. But Darth Revan intact was a weapon pointed at everything the Order protected. So the Council wiped his memory. Completely. They destroyed Darth Revan's identity and built a new person in the ruins. A loyal Republic soldier, capable and trustworthy, with no knowledge of who he had been, what he had ordered, or what he had become. They didn't imprison him. They didn't execute him. They assembled a new person from his parts and aimed that person at the war the original Revan had started. That person is who you are when KOTOR begins. You wake up aboard the Republic warship Endar Spire, under Sith attack, an amnesiac soldier with combat reflexes that don't match your rank and memory gaps you can't account for. The ship is going down. You escape to the surface of Taris with a Jedi named Bastila Shan, navigate the planet's occupied streets, get off-world, and begin following a trail of star maps toward the location of the Starforge, the Sith Empire's power source that Revan himself had used. BioWare takes roughly 30 hours to build everything around you. Companions, friendships, a deepening sense of purpose, a growing fluency with the Force. The skills come back too easily for someone who shouldn't have them. The Force feels familiar in ways you have no explanation for. On a second playthrough, the hints are everywhere. Bastila's careful deflections when the conversation touches your past. The ease with which techniques return that a Republic soldier wouldn't have learned. Specific moments where your character's dialogue choices reveal instincts that don't fit the cover story. BioWare planted them, knowing most first-time players would miss all of them. That's the design. You're living inside Revan's erasure, walking his path back to his own crimes, and the game has built his ghost into its architecture at every junction. Bastila was present at the original capture. She participated in the operation that produced you, the wiped, reconstructed, deployable version of the most dangerous person in the galaxy. She knows exactly who you are throughout the entire game. She doesn't tell you. She falls in love with you anyway, or with whatever the Council assembled from Revan's wreckage, and the love story KOTOR builds is constructed entirely on that foundation of deliberate concealment. The game doesn't flag this as obviously monstrous. It builds it as romantic. It lets you decide what the gap between those two things means. Darth Malach captures you aboard the Leviathan. He tells you what Bastila couldn't. Your name is Darth Revan. The soldier's name for you is a Council-issued fiction. The Jedi who've been helping you toward a victory over the Sith built you from a man who built the Sith's most powerful weapon, and they aimed you at his own creation without your knowledge or consent. The reveal doesn't just recontextualize the plot. Every authority figure who helped you along the way. Every warm moment with Bastila. Every piece of institutional trust you extended to the Order. All of it was constructed around that central lie, and the Council decided the lie was necessary. What KOTOR does after that revelation is what permanently separates it from anything Star Wars had achieved before 2003. You are given Revan's full identity and then asked what you want to do with it. The game presents two complete paths. Accept redemption, defeat Malach at the Starforge, save the Republic, or reclaim the darkness, step back into Darth Revan, take the Empire that was always yours. Both endings are playable, both fully realized, both genuinely possible. The canonical ending, established years later by SWTOR's Shadow of Revan expansion, is the light side. Redemption achieved, Malach defeated, the Republic saved. But the dark side path exists in the same code, the same character. Both possibilities live inside Revan simultaneously, and the question of which one is the real Revan doesn't have a tidy answer. Was he the Jedi Knight who defied his council to stop a genocide? The general who adopted a victory at all costs philosophy that cost him his humanity incrementally? The Sith Lord who built a war machine from an ancient superweapon? The amnesiac who rebuilt a self from manufactured fragments? the redeemed hero carrying trauma he couldn't fully remember earning. KOTOR doesn't adjudicate between these versions. It presents them all as simultaneously true, and leaves you in the room with the question. The post-KOTOR arc deepens every tragedy already in place. Drew Karpyshyn, the senior writer on KOTOR who also authored the Revan novel connecting the game to SWTOR, follows Revan into the years after his redemption. Married to Bastila, living on Coruscant, beginning to experience fragments of memories the Council's wipe hadn't fully excised. Glimpses of the unknown regions. Glimpses of something vast and patient and ancient, waiting at the edges of known space. Something worth falling for, or that had at least convinced him it was. He investigates. He finds it. The Sith Emperor Vitiate captures him, and holds him for 300 years. Vitiate and Revan's minds linked during the imprisonment, the Emperor drawing power and intelligence through the connection, while Revan resisted from inside captivity with no visible walls. 3 centuries of history accumulated above his head. Wars, political restructuring, the systematic extinction of Jedi survivors, the sacking of Coruscant itself. He endured it in the dark, surviving in the only way available to someone whose existence had become purely interior resistance. When he appears in SWTOR, first in the Foundry, later as a fractured, split persona in the shadow of Revan expansion, he is operating simultaneously as antagonist and victim, the line between hero and villain dissolved by 300 years of a specific kind of torture. His SWTOR arc received criticism for an ending that felt rushed, a conclusion that didn't honor the character's accumulated weight. The disappointment is its own data point. The community's expectation of Revan had grown so large that any resolution felt insufficient by definition. He remains the Old Republic era's fixed star. 300 years after KOTOR, every major story still bends around him. His arc is the most complete fallen hero narrative in Star Wars history. Jedi who defied his order, General who accepted any cost, Sith who built an empire, amnesiac who rebuilt a self, redeemed hero still carrying the shape of everything he'd been, prisoner held for centuries by a god emperor, and its completeness depends entirely on its willingness to leave things unresolved. He's good at the end of KOTOR. He's not clean. Both things are true and neither cancels the other. Anakin Skywalker's redemption takes approximately 10 minutes of screen time in Return of the Jedi. Revan's takes a decade of storytelling across 3 games, 1 novel, and an expansion pack, and still arrives incomplete. That's not a flaw. That's the architecture of genuine moral weight. Darth Nihilus was at Malachor V, not as a combatant or a commander, present when the mass shadow generator fired in 3960 BBY. He survived the detonation that fractured a planet and devastated 2 fleets simultaneously. The force wound the weapon created didn't kill him. It turned him into something that had never existed before. The Legends terminology describes it precisely. He became a wound in the Force given physical shape. The mass shadow generator's catastrophic effect on the Force at Malachor V transformed him from whatever he had been, probably a Republic soldier, based on later sourcebook references, though his pre-transformation identity was never conclusively established, into a rupture in reality that had developed an appetite. The hunger wasn't ideological. It wasn't strategic or personal or motivated by ambition. It was organic, the way gravity is organic, a fundamental property of what he had become, operating without decision or preference, pulling force energy from living beings the way a drain pulls water. Individual people couldn't satisfy it. Gatherings of force sensitives couldn't satisfy it. Only entire planets could sustain him, temporarily, before the hunger returned. His physical form followed his nature across the years. Whatever remained of the person who survived Malachor V reportedly infused itself into his robes and his mask, spirit extracted from a disintegrating body and anchored to armor because there was nothing else left to inhabit. When Darth Nihilus speaks in KOTOR 2, the audio is corrupted, fragmented, barely recognizable as communication. Hunger expressing itself in the closest approximation to language that a wound in the Force can manage. No translator can parse it. The game's other characters respond to him, but can't explain what he said or what he wants, because what he wants isn't articulable through speech. He operates below the threshold of negotiation, below the threshold of ideology, in territory where motivation becomes indistinguishable from natural law. He joined the Sith triumvirate, alongside Darth Sion and Darth Traya, which took control of what remained of Revan's disbanded Sith Empire and directed it toward a specific goal: the First Jedi Purge, the systematic elimination of surviving Jedi Order members who had escaped the Jedi Civil War. Nihilus contributed to this project in the only way available to him. Katarr was a planet inhabited by the Mirror, a near-human species born without eyes, whose perception of reality operated entirely through the Force. Not as a secondary ability layered over conventional senses, the Force was the totality of their sensory access to the world. They saw through it, navigated through it, understood their environment and each other through it. The Mirror on Katarr perceived everything that existed around them as a texture of Force presence. Every person, every tree, every stone registered as a distinct signature in a constantly flowing field of life. The surviving Jedi Masters had gathered there in secret conclave. Dozens of the Order's remaining senior figures assembled to discuss the Triumvirate's threat and determine how to respond. They believed the location was secure, the meeting known to no one outside their number. Nihilus arrived in orbit. What followed took approximately as long as it takes to describe. He consumed the planet, pulled the Force out of every living thing on Katarr simultaneously, feeding on an entire world the way a person drinks from a glass. The Mirror, whose connection to the Force was the totality of their perception, died in an instant. The field that constituted their entire sensory experience collapsed all at once. Their civilization, their history, everything they had built on that world stopped existing. The Jedi Masters assembled in secret conclave. The most experienced survivors of the Order's near extinction were gone. Katarr became a quiet planet. One Mirror survived. Nihilus kept her. Not from mercy, not from any response to her as a person, but as a tool. Something to send ahead, a pair of Force-sensitive eyes he could direct toward the next target. Her name was Visas Marr. She had felt the deaths of every person she had ever known all at once, because she felt everything through the Force, and the Force had just been stripped from an entire world while she was connected to it. She survived that experience enslaved to the thing that had caused it, carrying survivor's guilt so complete that it had compressed past grief into something resembling the absence of self-worth. When she appears in KOTOR 2 as a companion to Meetra Surik, she speaks about her own life as though it has no value, because she absorbed that lesson in the moment Katarr died, and nobody has challenged it since. Her arc across the game is a slow reconstruction of the belief that existence matters. It's one of the most quietly devastating character studies in a game full of them. Nihilus's defeat on his flagship, the Ravager, is the most formally elegant thing KOTOR 2 achieves. Meetra Surik was at Malachor V too. She gave the order to activate the mass shadow generator, and the Force wound that detonation created affected her as well. She became a wound in the Force herself, a presence that registers to Force-sensitive perception as absence. She doesn't feel like a person standing there. She feels like a whole. When Nihilus moved to consume her, his ability failed. There was nothing to feed on. The void reached toward the void and found only its own nature reflected back. The weapon that had devoured an entire civilization, turned against a specific and precise absence, had nothing to grip. His companions, Visas Marr among them, the woman whose entire people he had consumed and then enslaved, helped bring him down. He died because the catastrophe that created him also created the only person in the galaxy his nature couldn't process. His mask survived. Sith artifacts rarely conclude. The boss fight in KOTOR 2 is deliberately anticlimactic for a being who has destroyed worlds. Surik's nature makes Nihilus manageable in a way that nothing about him suggests he should be, and the ease of the encounter is the mechanical expression of a thematic point. The void creates its own undoing. He is defeated not by power overwhelming his power, not by a weapon capable of matching his, but by a specific absence, one person shaped by the same catastrophe in a mirror image. The thematic architecture of that solution requires the story to have held Nihilus as inexplicable for the 20 hours preceding it, so that the logic of his defeat lands as a closed philosophical argument rather than a game mechanic. There is no version of Darth Nihilus that works in a family-friendly adaptation without being fundamentally changed. His specific horror is incomprehensibility, a being who communicates in corrupted sound, who operates from appetite rather than ambition, who has no goals that can generate dramatic conflict in the conventional sense because goals require a self. Give him a sympathetic origin that generates audience identification, and he becomes a tragic villain, a workable category, a category the franchise already has. Keep him as he is, motivation-free, alien, hunger-wearing armor, and any adaptation process built around family-appropriate content will find the extinction of an entire species to be a tonal problem requiring creative solutions. Both adjustments diminish what he is. There isn't a third path through, and the story knows it. KOTOR 2 builds him specifically as something the narrative can't redeem, can't explain, can't resolve through heroic action, except via the precise accident of Surik's nature. That's not a production challenge to be solved. That's the design. June 1st, 2009. BioWare and LucasArts released a cinematic trailer for a game that wouldn't launch for another 2.5 years. The trailer was titled Deceived. Blur Studio produced it entirely in photorealistic CGI, and it won Best Trailer at E3 2009, a gaming convention award, for a promotional video, for a product the audience couldn't play yet. By any credible argument, it's the single most cinematically accomplished Star Wars sequence produced in the decade between Revenge of the Sith and The Force Awakens. Not a film, a game trailer. The distinction matters because of what it implies about the gap between what the Old Republic era generated as marketing material and what the franchise was delivering theatrically. The sacking of Coruscant unfolds across 3.5 minutes with the cold logic of a plan that worked exactly as intended. The Great Galactic War between the Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic had ground on for decades, both sides exhausted, both sides beginning to calculate what an ending might cost. Peace negotiations were arranged. The Republic sent its strongest Jedi and its most senior diplomats to Alderaan for the talks, stripping Coruscant of its primary line of defense in the process. The Sith had never intended to negotiate. While the Republic's delegation waited in the conference rooms of Alderaan, Darth Malgus led a Sith strike team directly to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. The cinematic opens on the temple's exterior, a structure that had stood for centuries as the most architecturally imposing symbol of Jedi presence in the galaxy. The visible declaration that the Order existed was powerful and wasn't going anywhere. Malgus arrives not through a siege, but through the front entrance, his team cutting through the doors while the temple's defenders scramble to organize a response. Jedi Master Ven Zalo meets them in the Great Hall, a human Jedi, composed, clearly reading the situation correctly, already organizing the space around him for a defense he knows won't hold. He buys time. He issues precise instructions to the Jedi around him, positioning them, giving them specific tasks, managing the loss of the opening exchange with the discipline of someone who has accepted the outcome and is choosing how to meet it. He fights Malgus directly. The duel isn't balanced. Malgus is larger, stronger, and fueled by something that isn't technique, a howling intensity that operates past the threshold where tactical discipline provides an advantage. Zalo fights beautifully and loses anyway, and what Malgus does in the moment of victory strips the scene of anything resembling triumph. He shouts rage into the dead man's face, a roar with nowhere to go, a Sith who has won the thing he wanted and found the winning insufficient. Paul S. Kemp's Deceived novel, named for the trailer and expanding Malgus into a full character rather than an action sequence, renders him as someone who built his entire identity around direct conflict as the purest form of engagement between enemies, and who would spend the years following the sacking discovering that the institution he'd given everything to was primarily interested in politics. The temple falls. Coruscant burns. On Alderaan, the Republic's delegation receives word of what has happened to their capital and learns simultaneously that they have no leverage remaining. They sign whatever the Sith present. The Treaty of Coruscant ended the Great Galactic War, not technically unconditional surrender, but everyone alive understood the Sith had won. The Republic's political and military leadership sat in Alderaan conference rooms, while the center of their civilization was dismantled, and the treaty they signed in that condition was the document the galaxy had to build the next era around. What the cinematic refuses to do is what makes it endure. No reinforcements arrive, no last-minute reversal, no moment where anyone finds a contingency that changes the equation. Ven Zalo made his stand and died making it. The temple burned with nobody available to stop the burning. The deceived trailer presents a complete event, a defeat without ambiguity, a loss without the narrative compensation of heroic near success, and it holds that outcome without flinching. Blur Studio also produced 2 additional SWTOR cinematics, Hope and Return, released alongside the game's 2011 launch, both re-released in 4K for the game's 10th anniversary in November 2021. All 3 function simultaneously as the most ambitious video game marketing material in Star Wars history, and as legitimately accomplished cinema in their own right. Together, they represent a declaration by BioWare and LucasArts. The Old Republic era warranted production values commensurate with what they believed they were building. SWTOR, the MMO that launched in 2011, takes place in the Cold War that follows the Treaty of Coruscant. The war is coming back. Both sides know it, and both are maneuvering through a peace neither believes in, toward the next conflict neither can prevent. The game's world is shaped by the texture of that interval. Institutions managing decline, individuals navigating compromised loyalties, the Republic living in the knowledge that its capital fell, and the Sith living in the knowledge that winning didn't solve anything. The sacking earns its structural place in the Old Republic's architecture because it operates at the scale personal tragedy can't reach. KOTOR is intimate, one man and one identity and one choice, while the sacking is civilizational, the Republic's center failing while its leadership watches from another planet. Both scales are necessary. Neither resolves the other's questions. None of this would exist without a specific creative environment. LucasArts gave BioWare latitude. KOTOR launched in 2003 as an RPG set 4,000 years before the Skywalker saga, in a period of Star Wars history established only loosely in comics and sourcebooks. The format itself was the first act of creative freedom, and the format's consequences were substantial. An RPG means player agency. Player agency means moral choice. Moral choice in Star Wars means the player can choose the dark side, not observe a character choosing it from a narrative distance, but make the decision personally, accumulate dark side alignment points, watch the game's systems reward cruelty, and measure mercy as a cost. The light side path requires discipline, restraint, patience, choosing the harder option when the easier one is available. The dark side path requires permission. Just stop declining what the game is offering. When KOTOR reveals that you are Revan, the twist doesn't operate as conventional narrative revelation. It operates as a statement about complicity. You have been inhabiting the fallen hero for 30 hours. Whatever choices you made during that time, how you treated companions, who you killed or spared, what you chose when the game presented a moral decision, those were Revan's choices. The game collapses the distance between player and character, specifically to make the moral weight of his arc land harder than passive observation can accomplish. You don't feel about Revan's fall the way you feel about Anakin's fall, watching it from a theater seat. You're inside it, deciding in real time whether to complete it or reverse it. KOTOR 2, developed by Obsidian Entertainment and released in 2004, extended the darkness from the personal into the philosophical. Kreia, the game's most morally complex character, and one of the best-written figures in any Star Wars story, spends the entire runtime interrogating the Force itself. She argues across 20 hours of carefully constructed dialogue that both the Jedi and the Sith are parasites feeding on a living galaxy, that dependence on the Force is a disease rather than a gift, that the moral binary the franchise operates on is a comforting fiction preventing genuine understanding of causality. KOTOR 2 doesn't conclude that she's right. It doesn't conclude that she's wrong. It presents her argument with complete seriousness, allows it to develop fully, and leaves the player with a question the films have never formally asked: whether the Force is a living mystery or a crutch for people unwilling to face consequence on its own terms. A Star Wars film can't sustain that question because the franchise's structural identity, its commercial and cultural identity, depends on the Force being ultimately, obviously good. The question would dissolve the foundation. KOTOR 2 asks it anyway, through 20 hours of meticulous argument, and the genre format gives it the time to do so without destroying the story around it. The RPG format gave BioWare and Obsidian something film can't give a director: duration without imposed compression. 30 hours to construct Revan's identity before dismantling it. Enough space for Krea's philosophical argument to accumulate weight before landing. Room for Nihilus to remain inexplicable across multiple encounters, so that his inexplicability registers as horror rather than weak characterization when you finally face him aboard the Ravager. A film gives 2 hours, and a sequel gives 2 more. A game gives the story as long as the story needs, and these stories needed time. Studer arrived in 2011 carrying KOTOR's narrative ambitions into an MMO format. 8 class stories running in parallel, each equivalent to a full-length RPG campaign, embedded inside a shared multiplayer world. The Blur Studio cinematics were the public declaration of that ambition. The following year, 2012, Disney acquired Lucasfilm. In April 2014, Disney and Lucasfilm formally reclassified the Star Wars Expanded Universe as Legends. KOTOR, Studer, the Revan novel, the Nihilus lore, the Treaty of Coruscant, everything. Still real, still available, still beloved by millions of people who had built portions of their imaginative lives inside these stories. Officially relocated to an alternate universe shelf. Future canonical Star Wars wouldn't be required to acknowledge any of it. The exact origin of the decision is somewhat contested. Some argue Lucasfilm began decanonization planning before the Disney sale finalized, that the sequel trilogy's creative team needed a clean continuity slate regardless of corporate ownership. What the record shows is the formal announcement came in April 2014, under Disney's ownership, and its effect on the Old Republic fanbase was a specific and named loss. Not the retirement of old material in favor of new, the removal of these particular stories from the universe they'd been built to inhabit. The sequel trilogy drew a specific complaint from Old Republic fans that clustered around one structural observation. The new films returned Star Wars morality toward the binary the prequel trilogy had worked to complicate. The Force Awakens reset the galaxy's political configuration to near identical coordinates as the original trilogy. Imperial remnant, Sith Lord in a black mask, planetary superweapon deployed against the Republic, without interrogating why the same war was happening again 30 years later. The Last Jedi engaged more seriously with Jedi institutional failure, but resolved that failure through individual heroism rather than systemic reckoning. The capacity for Jedi institutional error, which the Old Republic era had constructed as an entire era's load-bearing theme, the council that sat out the Cathar massacre, the council that wiped Revan's mind and called it strategy, the order that built its own destruction through accumulated failures of judgment, never arrived at its logical conclusion in the sequel trilogy's storytelling. Disney Plus introduced a more complicated picture. The Mandalorian worked as a contained genre piece, Andor worked at a level that surprised people who had written off the platform's Star Wars output entirely. A 12-episode espionage drama tracing Cassian Andor's political radicalization, it depicted organized oppression, prison labor, systematic surveillance, and the grinding moral cost of resistance, without the franchise's gravitational pull toward affirmation. Cassian commits atrocities in the service of causes he believes in. He receives no absolution for them. Scholars examining the franchise have characterized Andor as the darkest Star Wars media in the property's history, and the characterization holds. It's also genuinely excellent television that demonstrates what the platform can produce when the creative mandate allows it. Andor is the strongest argument available to anyone who wants to believe a Disney-era Old Republic adaptation could honor its source material. The counterpoint is specific rather than general. Andor is a grounded espionage drama about a mortal man with no force abilities, operating in a recognizable political landscape of occupation and resistance. Its darkness is human scale, conscience under pressure, the cost of complicity, what oppression does to people over time. That's one register of darkness, handled exceptionally well. The Old Republic requires a different register entirely, a wound in the Force consuming an entire civilization because that is its nature. A capital's destruction while the peace delegation watches from another planet. An imprisoned hero surviving 3 centuries of psychic captivity, fragmented past legibility. The darkness Andor handles is the darkness prestige drama handles. The Old Republic's darkness has no direct genre template. It lives in territory between cosmic horror, tragedy, and philosophical inquiry. And the medium that built it was one where the audience spent 30 hours making the protagonist's choices before the story asked them to sit with the consequences. The KOTOR remake offers concrete evidence about the difficulty of returning to this material under current conditions. Aspire was announced as the developer in September 2021. Development encountered significant problems. Screenshots from what appears to be a cancelled Aspire version surfaced publicly. The project transferred to Saber Interactive, and the current development status remains officially vague, despite a Saber CEO confirming the remake is still in progress. Bringing KOTOR back as a video game, in a format already proven capable of handling the material, has proven substantially harder than the announcement suggested. The Darth Bane trilogy, Drew Karpyshyn's 3 novels tracing the Sith's establishment of the Rule of Two, roughly 1,000 years after the Old Republic era, has been cited by fans alongside KOTOR and SWOTOR as material that deserves a major adaptation, on the grounds that stories of this quality shouldn't remain accessible only to readers who find their way to a specific section of the Legends shelf. The argument frames access as the primary variable. A generation has grown up with no practical path into these narratives, and an adaptation reaching 30 million viewers would serve the material by giving it an audience it hasn't had. The protectionist response is also specific. Darth Nihilus, as he exists in KOTOR 2, can't be made comprehensible to a general audience without being changed in ways that dismantle what makes him work. His horror is inexplicability, appetite in armor, corrupted speech, a motivation so reduced it has passed through ideology and ambition and arrived at pure biological necessity. Explain him sympathetically, and he becomes a tragic villain. A useful category, but not Nihilus. Keep him alien, and the content evaluation processes any major platform uses will register the extinction of an entire species as a tonal problem requiring a creative solution. Both paths change the specific thing that makes him matter. Revan's reveal depends on the player feeling genuinely implicated in the fallen hero's history across 30 hours of inhabited decision-making, a mechanism that ceases to function the moment the story becomes something watched rather than inhabited. The sacking of Coruscant requires a narrative structure willing to let the good guys lose and leave that loss in place. Disney's structural preference for stories that ultimately affirm the resilience of the light, a preference consistent across decades of IP management, commercial in origin and genuine in execution, conflicts directly with what each of those 3 elements requires. Both positions are internally coherent. The resolution, if there is one, comes from what actually gets made and whether the creative team, given the material, has the freedom and the understanding to honor it. What BioWare built across KOTOR and SWOTOR is a Star Wars where a hero's defiance of corrupt institutional authority leads, comprehensibly and inevitably, to his own transformation into the thing he fought against. where the Jedi Council's most morally consequential act is the destruction and reconstruction of a person's identity in the name of strategic necessity. Where a Sith Lord isn't a dark mirror of heroic ambition, but an absence that consumes worlds, defeated only because the same catastrophe that created him also created the one specific void his nature couldn't process. Where the capital of civilization falls on a Tuesday afternoon, and the galaxy has to keep existing in the world that fact created, without a rescue, without a reversal, without anyone arriving in time. Revan's fall began with a choice most people would call correct, a Jedi witnessing a genocide the Council had decided to ignore, deciding that patience was the wrong response. The fall didn't happen in that moment. It accumulated across years of a war he'd started by doing the right thing through means the Order had refused to sanction, each costly tactical decision making the next one slightly more available, until the man who donned a Mandalorian's mask as a symbol of intervention had become something the symbol was supposed to oppose. The tragedy isn't the darkness. The tragedy is how well lit the road to it was, every step of the way. That's Star Wars as it could always have been, built for an audience willing to inhabit moral complexity across 30 hours, rather than observe it from 2. Willing to sit with questions that don't resolve. Willing to accept that some wounds don't heal cleanly, and some victories arrive incomplete. The Old Republic is the best era in all of Star Wars. If you played KOTOR, you already know. If you played SWOTOR, you definitely know. What happens to it next is a question the comment section has been arguing about since before anyone formally asked it. Subscribe for more stories like this.